Welcome to Quilting's first reality show, live and unscripted, with Susan Smith.
Hello, my friends, and welcome. I'm Susan Smith, and you are in my studio, Stitched by Susan. This is an episode that we call Live and Unscripted because I'm live streaming, this is real time, the quilting of an actual project. Today's project is a little bit unusual in that the backing and batting have already been cut to a hexagonal shape, and I'll tell you more about that story as we go today. But I've worked out a process to deal with that. How do you load that on the long arm? Because you've got those angled corners and the shorter sides. So how is one going to do that? So that's kind of the overriding topic today. And then, of course, as always, I'll talk through the loading process and the thread choice process and the batting and then the actual free motion quilting of it as we go. And so you'll get to see all the things in real time. No editing. So if things happen, mics break down, thread breaks, you get to see it all in real time. The design we'll be quilting is Filaments, which is the same as the one on the wall behind me. It's kind of a loopy, reminds me of electric bulb, filaments. We don't see those so much anymore with LED bulbs, but used to be what a filament looked like. So that's what we'll be quilting. You are welcome to ask questions throughout the show, so please precede your questions with QQ, so that we can search for them and find them. One Q is not enough because it brings up all the words that say quilt, right? But a double Q will really help us so we can find the questions when it's time to answer them. So I'll take some pauses throughout to stop and answer your questions. Before we get started, a couple of things that I want to say. One is an enormous thank you to others who help make this live production possible. First and foremost, my husband, Mr. Producer, Dave. That's the back of his head. There you go. And his little spider web of electronics over there. So appreciate all of that. Our son Will, who does the introductory voices, there's a few of them. They kind of vary from week to week. And then last but definitely not least, our good friend Dan Unger, who graciously allows us to use his beautiful guitar music as a background to all these shows. So it's very calm, very soothing, very lovely. Thanks, Dan, for letting us use that. And then today, too, a thank you to my friend Joanne, whose quilt I'm working on today. So she is gracious enough to allow me to do that. And a lot of the quilts that I do in these live and unscripted shows are, in fact, client quilts. So it's always with their knowledge and they're okay on it. So, but it's just fun to see, I feel like, real quilts in progress. So that's what I aim to show you, the actual process, the actual decisions, the actual choices that have to be made and kind of why, in the hopes that this will help you in your quilting journey too. Also, if you're interested in some easy listening, I have a podcast as well. It's called Measure Twice, Cut Once. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts, but also I've not released any new episodes lately, but I've been releasing all the previous episodes on my YouTube channel. So there's actually a playlist called Podcast. So you can be playing it on YouTube, and there are live captions there and also pretty pictures of quilting feeding through behind that. So that's a couple places you can find that. And if you're interested in supporting this show, YouTube, of course, is free to watch, free for everyone. But if you're interested in supporting our production, you can do that easily by going to buymeacoffee.com/Stitched by Susan. Difficult to read on the screen, isn't it, against my dark quilt? But there it is. There you can do it for as little as $5 one time, or if you wish, you can agree to contribute each month. And every dollar that we receive there goes straight into up-leveling our equipment, lighting, cameras, sound equipment, and so forth, so that we keep producing a better and better show. And if you wonder if that's really true, look at a couple that are 2 years old, and you'll see the difference. It's kind of amusing/embarrassing to look back at those. But there it is. That's how you learn, right? Okay, today's show. Have I missed anything vital, Mr. Producer, sir? Let's see. I think we've got it. If you're enjoying this as we go, please do give a thumbs up. That's what helps it to get seen by more quilters. And there's even time to share with both of your friends. Susie is asking, is that like Patreon? It is similar, although Patreon usually delivers additional content in return for the subscription. Buy Me a Coffee is strictly a gift. But there's no strings attached. There's no expectation. You don't get put on an email list or anything like that. It's just entirely optional if you want to support the YouTube channel. We sure appreciate it. Okay. I think we're going to get started, and we'll talk more as we go about this project and about other places you might find some of my material too, okay? Let's get started. So today's project, maybe you guessed from the introductory music that we had going at the beginning, it has to do with Christmas. It's a tree skirt. So what happened with this tree skirt, it belongs to my friend Joanne, and her initial plan was to kind of stitch in the ditch, quilting it. It's made with 5-inch blocks. What are they called now? Oh gosh, it slips my mind, but the pre-cut 5-inch blocks. And so simple piecing, and her idea was to just stitch in the ditch, quilt it at her domestic sewing machine. But she was having trouble with the back kept wrinkling, the batting was wrinkling inside, and finally she just said, Susan, would you just quilt this for me? Sure, I will. But in an effort to reduce the bulk at her domestic machine, she had already trimmed off the corners of the backing and the batting. So they were already had that hexagon shape. And of course, I need a square shape. I need long straight sides to attach onto the long arm. If I just attached those shorter sides, I'd have flappy bits on the side, and that just wouldn't work. There would be no tension on that. So what I did, they're called charm packs. Thanks, you guys. It's so funny sometimes when I'm on air like this, I do just have an absolute brain lapse. Anyway, that was one of them. Here's what I did. I put a big old contrasting fabric on so you can see it. I basically sewed a corner on to the edge of this. And I'm going to show you something. I've got my little, hang on while I walk out of camera, got moved here. I have a little object lesson for you because this is kind of important. Bear with me a sec while I get it all organized. We clearly bumped it in our messing around with the camera. Okay. So I'm thinking to myself, I want to put these corners on the edges, right? So I can cut a big block, and my first thought was I'll cut a square, big square, and I'll cut it in fourths, and I'll have 4 triangles, which is true. But as you can imagine, if I cut my 4 triangles, what happens is this longest edge is then on the straight of grain, and both the shorter edges are on bias. So I would have been sewing my straight of grain onto my backing, and my outer corners would be a bias edge. I did not think that was going to work very well for loading it on the long arm. So I actually, look at all my little pieces. This was so fun. So I actually cut my square and then just cut it in half. So I cut 2 squares and snipped them in half, making this long edge now be a bias. But my 90-degree angle is on the straight of grain, both those edges, making it a little more stable when I go to load it on the long arm. How did I determine what size to cut it? This is what I did. It wasn't very fancy. I folded down this hexagonal bit, this edge, kind of like so, right? And I just measured how big that fold was. And then I added like 2 inches. And that's the size I cut my square and then chopped it in half. So it didn't perfectly match at the corners. And in fact, when Joanne cut those corners off, I think she just probably did it with the scissors. They weren't even all the same size. And that doesn't really matter. What is critical is that when it's all said and done, I have 1 straight edge for the front. So after I had my block sewn on, I did straighten up this edge. Can you see that? I folded it, etc., got it on the straight of grain, and cut me 1 nice straight edge. And that's going to be my loading edge. And you'll see as I load it why it matters that it's straight, and also why it really only matters that that 1 edge is straight. I think that's all my information about that. I did press my seams, and I pressed them toward the awkward corners. It doesn't really matter which way you press. Indeed, it doesn't really matter if you press. That just makes it a little flatter to work with. But that's all going to get trimmed off, right? Because this red and black portion is bigger than the tree skirt itself. So it's all going to get trimmed off on all directions. I think that's all the critical bits about that. I am going to mention one other thing though, and I put a note about this in the notes. When Joanne sent this to me, so she had done some of this stitching in the ditch on her domestic machine, right? And that stitching was still intact. Look at this tool that I used. Hon, you moved my stuff. He's in trouble. No, it's not. Hang on a sec here, guys, while I find it. Okay. Sorry about that. It's called a seam remover, and it's by Kai, K-A-I, who also makes lots of scissors and trimming tools. It's kind of like a little eyebrow shaver is actually what it's like, but bigger. What this enabled me to do was like to peel back that backing, and with this little razored edge, snip, 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 snip those threads. So it was way, way faster than undoing it stitch by stitch. So there is a link for this in the description below this episode so that if you want one too, it makes super fast undoing, especially when you're undoing quilting and you can peel back that whole layer. But honestly, it undoes seams very quickly too, even at the sewing machine. But you might like that handy little tool. However, particularly because this was black, there are definitely some little threads on there, as you might imagine. And Joanne's going to be picking threads for a while, let's just say. I did my best to get the loose threads off, but I know there's still some on there. So if you see them today, that's why. Okay, we're going to start loading. This is my straight edge, and this is why it matters that it's straight. This is going to establish the front edge of my quilt, and then the rest of it I'm going to just sort of throw over the back rail and then roll on, allowing the tension of rolling it to pull it on straight. So it does not matter at that point if my sides are a little wonky or if there's jogs where my triangle meets at the far corner. It doesn't really matter, and you'll see that as I roll it. Those edges are not necessarily cut straight, but it'll still roll on fine. The critical bit is that I do have a straight edge to start with. This is not a selvage edge, so I'm taking care when I hold this, 16 or 18 inches, that I'm not overly stretching it and that I'm not pushing it in. I just want it laying as flat and smooth as I can. Then I kind of anchor it with my one hand and then snap on the red snapper with my other hand. And I think I can get away with a shorter piece there. Let me just reach into my snapper storage. So again, I'm just making sure that it's flat and smooth, no puckers, and also no stretching. Snap that in place. So once that's in place, I take the remainder of my backing and toss it over the back rail. And I should put in here as a side note, I have modified how I load my quilting, my backing, from what Bernina originally intended for this machine. And I'm not sure how your machine works, but if you see that my leader is kind of wrapped over, that's why. When it unwraps and starts rolling up, you'll see that it fits nicely under my dead bar and everything comes out as it should be. So I'm pushing this over my back rail and I'm making sure that it's not pulled to either side. Can you see how these kind of wrinkles form if I pull it even a half an inch to one side or the other? So that too is critical. Straight front edge is critical, and smoothness going over the rail is critical. Then we can just roll it on and be confident that it's going to be straight and flat and not pulled askew. So now I'm going to just roll it on. And I'm just watching underneath for when the edge of my backing approaches the edge of the back leader. And then I'll walk around to the other side, make sure everything is smooth. And there is a seam right here in the backing, and it's pulling just a touch. So I'm just going to evenly smooth it out as best I can. And we'll clip this back end. And I keep one little magnetic bar over here just as a kind of anchor, right? And I just drop it on there while I'm right off at that end. Usually it does. Not 100% of the time, I'll tell you honestly. And again, this is what works best for me. Some people have found that bending it back opens up that channel a little bit more, makes it easier to apply. I find that I get a smoother result if I lay it over top and hold it with one hand and snap it in place with the other. Again, you're almost pinning it with this hand. Otherwise, for me, the fabric seemed to joggle out of place. That's just my experience. So on my snappers go. Snap, snap, snap. And I'll try not to puff into the microphone. Takes a little bit of effort. And now you saw that leader flop back over the top. And now I'll tighten up the front leader. And just like that, we have a smoothly loaded backing. Perfect, there it is. Okay, here's another fun thing. This lovely little piece of batting is what Joanne already had on it. And you can see the corners are clipped as well. And you can see that it's full of little black threads. Maybe you can see that from the undoing process. So I deliberated over a couple of things, and I'm going to show you because you might run into this decision too. So here's the quilt top. Okay, so the backing is quite dark, this red and black gingham. So I thought to myself, well, why don't I just replace this white batting with black? Then I don't risk,
I'm glad you all at
needle
least found
punctures and the fibers, bearding we call it, the white fibers from the batting poking through onto this backing. Yep, that sounds like a great solution, but do you see on the quilt top, there's a number of blocks that have a very light background. And I thought, well, I've got to check and see what the black batting looks like through that. So I literally got out a piece of black batting, put these fabric pieces over top of it. And yes, in fact, you can see that through. It looks dark behind there, dark gray, and that won't do. So though on many of these prints, and certainly on the backing, the black batting would have looked great, it does not look good on these light ones. And there are quite a few of them. So I finally had to conclude black batting won't work, back to the white. However, I do think that there's little enough light fabric. I do not think these little threads are going to show through. So I've chosen to go ahead and use the same batting again rather than cut a fresh piece. I don't think these little threads are going to show through at all. And again, I just laid it out on a flat area and had a look at it to try and determine. If there were truly white fabrics or if they were bigger, that might have been an issue. And then I would have just used a fresh piece of batting. I would not attempt to pick these all out. Believe me. But when I look at that now, I cannot at all see those little individual black threads through. Mr. Producer says I'm breathing heavy. Sorry about that, you guys. Happens sometimes when you're scurrying about quilting. Okay, so I'm just taking care now. I can see where my seam lines are, where my back extenders are added. I'm just making sure that I'm well within that. Again, I looked at this, laid out all layers flat before I loaded, so I know there's enough space at the bottom. I'm not going to run out of space down there. So I'm getting close-ish to the top rail and not right against it. And there we are. Now, one more thing that's a bit usual from my different method. I usually, at this point, just start basting. And I usually go up one side, across the top, and down the other. But because this edge, the cut charm squares, do have a bias edge, and it's just got more give and flexibility, I'm going to go ahead and put some pins in this to make sure it does, in fact, stay pretty square. I'm not doing really painstaking measuring. I'm eyeballing it. But I'm going to start by putting all the corners in place. I just want to make sure I've got control of where this is all ending up, right? Sometimes if you just do one long line of basting, it's apt to push out of the way. So some quilters actually will recommend that you start in the middle and go left, and start in the middle and go right. That would be an option too. But I'm managing it by pinning. And I see there definitely still are some threads on here. Because it's dark, they were harder to see, right? I did pick quite a few off, but there's still some little miscreants. So another thing I could consider at this point, particularly on these angled lines, I can't really stitch a terribly neat angled line freehand, especially going slow and basting. I could put my ruler plate on and actually use a ruler to get a nice straight basted edge, but I'm kind of interested in saving time. I'm interested in not losing my space that I lose at this front clearance when I have that ruler plate on. So I'm going to choose to just freehand it and not worry that it's not perfect, because it's going to all fall into the binding anyway. So that's my thinking there. Okay, a few more brass tacks before we start stitching. I'm working on my Longarm Stella. She's a Bernina Q24. I am using isocord thread in a very, very, very dark charcoal. It's not a true black. But honestly, most of these fabrics are not true black either. I've found that I like deep charcoal thread better than black. So that's my choice. I have it both top and bobbin the same isocord 40 weight, 100% polyester thread. I currently have my ruler foot on. You observant ones will notice that. I don't need it on because I'm not using a ruler. On the other hand, it's not hurting anything. So I've chosen to just leave it on.
Whoops.
Did I just bump the camera?
Nope.
Did we just lose the camera?
Yep.
Hang on, guys. We just lost the camera. Well, I'm going to go ahead and baste on the bigger viewpoint, and Dave will go ahead and try and fix that for you. I want a 1/4 inch basting. There we go. And as always, I'm just using my hands before and behind my actual presser foot to keep things in place, to pull in a little bit of easing if I need to. I think what I'll do here actually is turn on my stitch regulator. It's difficult to get the 1/4 inch stitches in any kind of particular placement, so I'm just going to do a little kind of zigzag with my usual 10 stitches per inch and just keep it well within the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then it doesn't matter if I stay straight, right? Goal is still accomplished. Basting is still done. I know you guys will give us feedback. It seems to me like the camera is really wobbling. It's visibly wobbling, the close-up camera. Oh, you're not seeing close-up now, are you? Well, for now you guys get the big picture view while we try to figure out what's happening with the camera. By the way, if you're a new watcher, this has been our single greatest challenge, and it has been huge. Because the machine is an arm, right? It's a long, it's like your domestic machine, but much longer. And then we add to it a camera, which is extended a little bit, and all of that together makes a significant amount of vibration and wobbling. So that has been our chief difficulty in overcoming, and we've tried different things over all the episodes that we've done, with varying degrees of success. But we now have this ultra padded mount for the camera, sort of a shock absorbing mount. So it does still visibly wobble to my eye, but it kind of magically reduces that before it sends it out to you. Okay, we've got our basting in place. We're going to whip all those pins out. Do we have any questions about that while I attach my side clamps and get ready to quilt? Okay, let me just get my one side clamp on here, and then I will come and answer it. I can see that these funky little corner seams are not going to go easily into my red snapper side clamps. I think I got that one. Okay. Let's take some questions.
Okay.
I will move Stella a little bit. Have we got our straight on camera? There we go. Okay. Question from Judy. Recently you mentioned on a video regarding loading the quilt, load the front first. Is the front the top of the quilt? Thank you. That's really a great question, Judy. The front really only means the edge that's facing me. It is sometimes the top, it is sometimes the bottom, and it is sometimes the side if I've got the quilt turned sideways. So it's good that you asked that. I should clarify that more. When I say front, I just mean the edge that's closest to me. Front of the quilt, back of the quilt. Doesn't really have anything to do with the actual print or piecing of the quilt. It's just how I've got it oriented on the long arm rails. Suzanne, how do you get the backing to go under the square-shaped bar that's under the upper take-up bar? At least there is one on my Q24. Yes, there is on mine too, Suzanne. The easiest way to see it would be in the month of October, I did daily live videos every day, and there was one on there where I showed kind of a side view of all of my bars and rails and described how I loaded it. But that is why my leader is flipped over, so that when it flips back, how do I describe it? I've got my leader rolled on the back bar. It comes under the dead bar and over. I attach the quilt, and then when it flops back, it's still under that dead bar. It works. And I did say at the beginning, it is modified from what Bernina suggests for method of loading, but this is the way that works well for me with a floated quilt top and for speed. So there's that. Ashley, when loading the backing, should I roll it up until the bar doesn't click anymore, or would that be too tight? Well, until the bar cannot click anymore, that is too tight. Like if you're wrenching on it until you literally can't get any more clicks, that is too tight. You really only want enough tension so that it's smooth and flat and no more. A high amount of tension, drum tight, means that your needle is having to puncture that, and the faster you go, the worse results you're going to get in terms of skipped stitches or thread breakage or even needle breakage if a whole quilt is stretched super, super tight. When you're going fast, there's so many stitches per minute, and that needle is actually flexing a little bit as it comes out of the quilt, and you're already moving the machine, right? So that, you're making that more and more the tighter you have the quilt. So only tighten it enough so that it's smooth and flat. Likewise, your side clamps. They shouldn't be stretched within an inch of their life as tight as that side band will go. They should just be gently pulled. Susie, have you seen the XXL sew tights? I haven't used them. I use red snappers. I've seen them, Susie, and seen other quilters using them. I don't have them myself, so I really can't speak about them. I can't imagine anything going much faster than the red snappers, so I haven't seen the need to invest in them. They're a bit expensive to get enough to do a big quilt, but I haven't used them myself, so I don't really have an opinion on that. Betsy, is there a slit in the top, or will that be cut in after the quilting? Great question, Betsy. It's going to be cut in after the quilting. And while you say it, I'm going to do it while I'm remembering. I'm actually going to stitch. I usually use about a 10 stitches per inch stitch length. And I'm going to bump that up to 12 today because that slit is going to get cut, and it's going to cut right through my quilting. So I'm going to suggest to Joanne, whose tree skirt it is, that she cuts it and binds it and doesn't, mess around with it or handle it much in between, so that doesn't come undone. And the shorter stitch length will also help to keep that a little more secure there. Sandra, good afternoon from Florida. I just saw the short video clip of Susan taking a quilt off the Longarm. I'd love to know what pattern it is. Sandra, I think that you probably mean one that had a gray background and it had some royal blue pops of colors, kind of stars. I don't think a pattern has been published. That was our local quilt guild, and they did a mystery quilt in 2023. So at our quilt show, which was just a couple of weeks ago in October, there were probably 15 different quilts, maybe even more than that, in all different colorways. Everyone had the same pattern, so it was kind of a localized thing. It is the Washington State Quilters Guild Spokane chapter. They do have a website, so if you wanted to try to reach out to them and see if that pattern is available, that would be an option. Kathy, why do you do a zigzag basting instead of a straight stitch? Is there a benefit to that? Not really, Kathy. I just knew I couldn't get a neat straight stitch slowly moving at an angle. When I do purposely use that scallop is when there's a lot that I have to ease in. That scallop really takes in some fullness. And the truth is, it doesn't matter what I use because it's not going to show either way, right? So I just did it because to me it looked better than having a wonky slant line. Now I've got a purposefully scalloped line. That's all. Madge, what is the shiny circular object above your stitching foot? Oh, Madge, what a great question. For a period of time, we had black electrical tape over that, and we forgot today. It's the thread cutter is behind that. It just looks so dang big on the camera. So mental note, we'll try and remember to cover that up again before the next episode, because I know it is distracting to see that little mirror. In fact, it's less than an inch in diameter, but it looks huge in the camera. Sandra, we saw this one already, Mr. Producer.
But you didn't answer. You said you can answer it later.
No, I did answer it. This was the pattern I was just talking about. We got that one twice. You're important, Sandra. Okay, side clamps. I'm struggling here because I see this might have been wise. You guys live and learn. I mentioned that I didn't trim all my edges straight. And because I didn't, I've got kind of a jog in my seam allowance on the left here. So when I'm trying to put my side clamp on, it's not working super easily. That might have been a good reason to trim that, just so that it would load more easily. And I don't have tons and tons of excess fabric, so I don't really have room to just attach my clamps. Like my single individual clamps without these long red snapper dealies. But I think I got it in. Success! So to the person who was asking about the tightness of a quilt sandwich, let me just show you. I'm going to move Stella so that you can see this overhead a little bit. Another quilter showed me this, but it's a great little test for how tight your quilt should be. So for one thing, you can see there is a certain amount of give in there, but it still looks pretty taut. But watch this. When I take my hand and push it up from underneath, I can grab my fingers. Can you see that? Like right to the first knuckle even. So it's loose enough that I can do that. And I don't know if you can hear that, I could crank it up several notches more. I choose not to. I only need enough tension to keep it smooth and flat. So both on my rollers and also on my side clamps. It does not have to be wrenched within an inch of its life. It just needs to be flat. That's all. Okay, I think we're ready to start quilting. Let's clap a couple magnets on the front. So because I have metal rails, I can drop these magnets on, and now I've got this edge secure, can't move, and of course all my basting. So all of this area now I can quilt and quilt and quilt, and it's not going to shift out of place at all. I'm just going to add my little yardsticks in before we go on. I'll do it at the end where you guys can see. Do you see how this kind of sags down at the sides? When it does that, or when I'm close into my basted edge and I'm afraid that the nose of my machine is going to bump up against this, I just use, in my case, yardsticks, but I've seen people use curtain rods, anything that's long and straight, just to put under my clamping system, just to hoist that up a little bit. And it just allows the arm of my long arm now to slide right under my side clamps without getting hung up on them. Where's my other yardstick? Here we are. Okay, and we have a question on the red snappers. Let's see that. Susie, what's the benefit of the red snapper side clamps versus what my Grace came with? I'm discovering I need more accessories than I originally thought. Here's the important feature to me. They're long, and the tension that's put on my quilt, it's the same tension through this whole throat space, right? The whole quilting area, as opposed to just putting on my clamp, which came with my machine, right? Then I would have pull right here and pull right here. I have a pair of them at each end. So that tends to make a scallop. You know, you get tension here and tension here, but nothing in here. So it doesn't have to be this brand. This is just a brand that I found that has this nice long tension. Also, they're quite slim in profile this way, which I like too, as opposed to being, say, a thick wooden one. I've seen wooden type clappers that do that, but then they're very bulky and chunky. So those features are kind of what you're looking for. I'm not really a promoter of one brand or the other. And by the way, I can just scoop my yardstick in and out. The closer in I put it, the more it lifts this up. So I'm just doing it until I can move my long arm under that clamp freely and it won't get hung up on it. Where do we want to start quilting? We have so many corners. I tend to start in the top right. I don't know why. That's just what feels comfortable for me. I do have my stitch regulator on. I may turn it off later, but I usually do at the beginning of a quilt just till I sort of get in the groove. So the quilting design I mentioned earlier, I call it Filaments. I saw it first in a paper napkin and kind of devised it from there. There is a pantograph out there called, I think, Knit One Purl Two, which is really similar to. Maybe she had the same no-name paper napkins. Who knows? but it's just a kind of loopy overall design. A little bit Christmassy, you know, the Christmas lights makes you think of filaments. I know it's going to be really difficult to see the quilting in many areas on this quilt, so appreciate it whenever I'm going over the light colored areas. And then I'll have to show you pictures afterwards, I guess. As so often, you know, these live and unscripted episodes very frequently are client quilts. So I don't devise them just for their appropriateness to filming, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So bear with it. It just was not intended to be a lesson. I'm just inviting you into my studio to see what it is that I'm working on. And today I'm working on a quilt where it's hard to see the quilting, at least for you. So I'm kind of doing cursive L-shaped loops, and they're more than an inch, perhaps an inch and a quarter in length. So I'm just doing a series of loops and then echoing back around them, and that's all it is. Rinse and repeat. So I did mention I put a shorter stitch length on so that I feel like the stitching is more secure because this is a tree skirt and because it's going to have a big opening cut into it. I know that it is. So I've got my machine right now set on 12 stitches per inch. So I have to take that into account if I'm going to stitch without the stitch regulator. What's that pace going to be to try and achieve, again, this shorter stitch length? And here I am over by the side clamps, and you can't really see it happening, but you can know it's working by the fact that I'm not clunking into the side of it. My little hold up with the ruler, with the yardstick, just keeps me from bumping into those side clamps at all. I think we're going to try it without the stitch regulator on. Let's see what's a good pace. That works pretty good. So can you hear now how the motor is just a consistent, even sound? So what I have set now, instead of stitch length, is I've set speed. So many stitches per minute. And on some machines, it's a percentage. And basically it's a percentage of the total stitches per minute that your machine is capable of. So what that means is the needle is moving at a fixed pace. I get this nice even sound, but it's up to me. I am 100% responsible now for the stitch length, and that is determined by how fast I move. So I'm endeavoring to make that stitch length look similar to the 12 inches or 12 stitches per inch that I was stitching at a moment ago. I quite enjoy stitching like this. I find the rhythmic quality, the evenness of the sound to be more pleasurable to stitch to. But that's just my personal opinion. We were talking in the pre-show a little bit about the fact that I was just at the Houston Quilt Festival last week and I was working in the Bernina booth, so I got to meet some of you all there. but also I got to talk to so many people about machine quilting. And one of the topics that we did cover was stitch regulator or not. And what I think is so cool is that we have that option. You know, some of the earlier long arms that were developed didn't have stitch regulators. So there are quilters, particularly ones who were quilting 20 years ago or 25, they learned to stitch without one because that was all that they had available to them. We're so lucky now, almost every long arm produced now has a stitch regulator. But I still think there's good reason for learning how to work without it. And part of it is just this rhythmic, smooth quality and the fact that it makes you quilt more smoothly. You can't jerk your way around your curves or it's going to show in your stitch length. So you end up focusing on smooth, even movements, and I think that can be nothing but good. That said, a stitch regulator is an absolutely wonderful thing, and I use mine a lot of the time. Particularly like when I'm beginning a quilt and I'm kind of trying to get in the groove, but also when I'm working on a new design and I don't want to think about stitch length, like it's just too many things to think about, put that stitch regulator on and then that's taken care of for you, and you can concentrate on smooth shapes or round circles or whatever the case may be, or just figuring out your thread path and where you're going to go next. But I do think in the long run and at some point in your quilting journey, it's really beneficial to get comfortable working without a regulator. It really ramps up your quilting skill. So now you can see the quilting lines. It really just is like cursive L's or E's and then echoing back over them. And maybe this is a good place to mention, these live and unscripted episodes are not lessons. Really, they're just inviting you into my studio when I'm working most frequently on client quilts. However, some of these designs I teach in my online course, Freehand Quilting Masterclass, and some of them I teach in my monthly membership. And if you've not done either of those, you might be interested in giving them a try. So my membership is called Advance, not advanced like really experienced quilters, but just advance, like you're advancing and learning. And in that membership, there's a lot of different things in it. Guest teachers, custom quilts, case studies, and so forth, but there's also new designs, and this is one of them that's been a fairly recent development for me. And so in that membership then I do actually teach it. I quilt it on fabric that makes it very visible. I just had a thread break. I quilt it on where you see high visibility and can get a picture of it. I break it down into steps. I do this and then I do this. I give you tips for traveling with it and moving around a quilt top. So that's the kind of thing that's available in my membership. So if you want info on that, you can always find it on my website, stitchedbysusan.com. So I always say with a thread break, the first time it happens, thread breaks just sometimes happen. If it happens again, we'll start doing some more deeper searching. So for the moment, I've just rethreaded. I actually saw it kind of stripping. One of the fibers broke and I stitched a couple more inches. So I've got to undo that bit because it was not stitching well at all. So what I like to do is go back to a point for one thing, because that's an easier place to splice it. And if I can, I'm going to find a point that is in a seam allowance, because I feel like that anchors the thread the best. And I'm going to do a splice right out here in the middle of the quilt. Nobody but you and I will ever know. But I just feel like it gives it a little more security if I look for a good place to put it. where that thread was stripped, it's super duper fine and it just sunk right into the fabric. It's difficult to undo. I have no idea if you can see this on camera or not. Undoing is never glamorous, but as I mentioned at the beginning, these live and unscripted episodes, none of the ugly is edited out, so you get to see all of the bits. And this is the reality of quilting. Stuff like this happens, and this is how you deal with it. This is how I deal with it anyway. Okay, so let's decide where we're going to go with our undoing. I'm looking right over here. Are we on the close-up camera, hon? Yeah, we are. Right down here. You can see where there's a crossover there, so there's kind of a point. Though my design is all curves, I've got to find a place to put that splice. And that seems like a good one for me. And again, there's a seam allowance right nearby. So this is where I'm going to place my splice, right in that curve, right in that seam allowance. And that, I believe, is going to hold it securely. So I'm just going to back up now until I get to that place that I've chosen. I'm still in areas where the thread is not looking right, and I can just see that by the look of the stitches. One of the plies was already broken. It's just too thin. It's hair fine there. But from this corner where I am now the thread looks better. So now I'm just going to back up a little more till I find a place that I think is a good securing spot and easy to camouflage. You know, it might even be the type of fabric. Like I would try not to put a splice in this red and white with my black thread, because that's really going to show, right? Would definitely show less if I was on the black and white plaid. And if I was doing it there, I'd put it on the black fabric or black check. Whatever I think will make it look more hidden. I might actually just do it right here. So again, there's seam allowance layers right here. So I'm gonna trim my threads on this side, and I'm going to start my stitching overlapping about 3 inches, about the width of that seam allowance. I'm going to do some lock stitches in those layers of seam allowance and then launch off into my quilting. And I think that will be quite secure. I think nobody will ever see it. And then we'll see what we'll see. So I pull both threads up. Now I've got my bobbin thread and my top thread in my hand. I'm going to take a few close lock stitches. I'm going to do it again. So that is pretty dang secure. That's not going anywhere. And I'm going to put the stitch regulator... No, I'm going to stay in manual. Change my mind. It is tricky to see on these black fabrics, let me tell you. Maybe that's the beauty of quilting a loopy design. It's not going to be the end of the world if I travel over something inadvertently. It's just going to look like one more loop, isn't it? But I will try not to. And my thread broke again. I feel like I've got it set at a fairly high speed because of having that short stitch length on and just wanting to get it done, you know? So I feel like maybe being on manual mode is not the best idea when I want this short of stitch length, because I think that's possibly the problem, is I've just got it going so fast. And in case inquiring minds want to know, I'm at 1400 stitches per minute. A little over 1400 is what I've been quilting at. So, you know what? Just to be on the safe side, I'm actually going to snip my thread and pull it out and just do a full rethread, just in case of the needle. But then I think we'll go back into the regulated and see if that fixes our dilemma. This is generally not a fiddly thread. I don't typically have thread breakage problems with it. A 40 weight is not a particularly lightweight thread. Okay. I just cannot even see to get the needle threaded. There we go. I think I got it that time. Now, once again, we've got to see where that happened on the black. Of course it did. And we've got to get back to where we have pretty stitching. Bear with me while I trim these thread tails and try and figure out exactly where I'm at here. So what I'm just doing is following the thread path where I stitched and trying to figure out where that break happened. I see it. Okay, this time I don't have that long area where it was stitching thin, so I'm just going to back up to a point. That's all I'm going to do. Overlap it about a 1/4 inch, make sure it's secure, and go on with my stitching. I know you guys can't see this at all. It's very difficult even for me. Okay, we've got manual mode, or sorry, regulated mode back on. So again, I'm overlapping 3 or 4 stitches. First I've got to trim that bobbin thread because I had it still attached. Overlapping about a 1/4 inch, 3 or 4 stitches, and really anchoring it. And I'll come back and clip the thread tails in a moment. Let's get those tails. I mean, there's 2 sides to the coin of it being difficult to see. Difficult for me to see what I'm doing when I need to undo or splice, but difficult for anyone viewing it afterwards to find my splice either. Sorry about that, I just moved the handlebar. Is it okay? It's so automatic in me to shift it sometimes just to be more comfortable. But I can't do that when I'm on air because there's a camera attached to it. So I'm coming up on the edge here. This is a great time to be typing in some questions if you have them. Also, if you're enjoying this real life look at quilting in the studio, please do give it a thumbs up. subscribe to the channel. And if you click on the little notification bell, you will receive notifications whenever I do go live. I endeavor to send out an email the night before as well. The night before, a day or two before, so that you know what's coming up, what the project is, etc. But just in case I don't get that done, click on that little notification bell. And if you don't have my newsletter and you would like to, it's usually twice a month or every second week, so not frequent. You can get that just by going to my website, stitchedbysusan.com, and you'll get a little pop-up form that invites you to sign up for the newsletter. So it lets you know when these episodes are. It lets you know things like I recently had an offer for a discount on rulers from Quilters Apothecary, things like that. Things that I think would be of interest to machine quilters. Okay, do we have any questions? Mr. Producer kindly brought me a hot coffee. Oh, and look, tell you guys a story. So my mug says Montana on it. So my story of the week was yesterday I got up early, at the crack of stupid, as my cousin always says. I got up early and flew to Billings, Montana, and test drove a car that we'd been shopping for online, gave it a good test drive and bought it and drove it home. So that was very fun. It was an 8-hour-ish drive home. So the Montana mug is very apropos this morning. Okay, questions? Oh, they're coming. Mr. Producer, he needs another set of hands. There's just so many things to do. Elaine, I'm very familiar with undoing, LOL. You know, we get really good at it, don't we? Yeah. Susie, should we finish the masterclass before we join the membership, or can we do them in tandem? You absolutely can do them in tandem, Susie. There's different designs. They purposely don't overlap or have the same material. However, if you're a current student in the masterclass, I always offer a deal on the membership at the end, so you might want to wait for that free sample. Diane, what size needle are you using with the 40 weight thread? Great question, Diane. I have a 90-14 in just a universal Schmetz needle. I did put a new one on. Again, thinking of the white batting, thinking of the possibility of fibers being driven through. That's one thing I can do to try and preempt that, is to use a real fresh, sharp needle. So I did. Joan, I never saw a photo shoot of Susan's birthday quilt online. Is that still on the to-do list? I know she's busy. Actually, Joan, it is finished. It is hanging on my living room wall. I'll try and get some pictures of it and get them posted. You're absolutely right. I should post photos of it. It is hanging though, and it looks gorgeous. My living room has there's a picture window that looks in, and so it's like my eye candy for people walking by my street. They can see in my large window and see whatever quilt I've got hanging. So I kind of rotate them, but right now it's the friendship quilt. Sue, wondering about the 3 guide trays on the back of the Q24 frame. My chain sometimes gets caught on the far left side, large quilts only. Spacing between my trays is different than the manual. Interesting, Sue. I can't say that I've ever had the chain that Sue is referring to is like a linked, it's kind of like a linked bar that all the cords go through on the Bernina machines, and then that chain rides back and forth. And Mr. Producer is chiming in on this, and he says consider adjusting your spacing, because if it's not right, that could be key. All I've ever had catch is camera cables, but that's on me because it's added cables that I've put on there, right? I've never had my chain on its own when I'm quilting catch. So I would look into that. I would say spacing might be suspect. Barb, watching you work, I was noticing the power cord on the back of your machine. Have you had trouble with it catching? What you're seeing, Barb, is the camera cable. We have an additional cable running down the back with multiple wires and cords in it. And yes, occasionally I have had trouble with that. We try and, before we come on air, we see how far we have to go right, how far we have to go left, is everything working smoothly, etc. It does sometimes resist a little bit. Yes, there are times. Any more? In the gray triangle, it looks like there's a blob of black thread. Is that a problem, or am I seeing things? You're right. You have sharp eyes. I did mention earlier, when this tree skirt came to me, there was stitching in the ditch in it, and I undid all that. and I showed you the little razor seam remover that I used, but it cuts the bobbin thread, leaving chunks of top thread, which I tried to remove too, but it being black, I clearly didn't get them all. So yes, long answer, that is a little blob of thread. It will pull out. I will do that after I'm finished quilting. I did not stop and remove it as I was going over it. You're right. Venetia, since you are so close to the edge during the last thread break, would it be a good idea to also change out the bobbin for a full one at the same time? You know, you absolutely could, Venetia, if you thought your bobbin was anywhere near running out. It would save one splice and perhaps save a tiny touch of time. You know, I put a fresh bobbin in to start, so I'm nowhere near the end of it, so I did not do that. But certainly that is an option, I thought. Pamela, when doing a small wallish quilt, do you baste the whole thing first or just the top part? Usually I just do the part that I'm working on. In my personal experience, if I baste even 2 passes and it's wrapped around the front rail and I quilt the top, when I pull that second part up, there seems to be excess. It seems to stretch that top layer a bit. So quilt size is 24 by 24 at most. You could for that, Pamela. Honestly, try it one way, try it another way, see what feels more comfortable for you. There isn't a wrong way there, I don't think. You can baste it or not. Either way works. Tammy, I'm having trouble with my quilts being wavy when I'm all done binding. Straight line quilting only. Any idea what might be the cause or a solution to prevent this? Actually, I do, Tammy. Let me put my coffee down because I have to use my hands here. So when you quilt with straight lines, let's say you're doing horizontal lines like this. What happens is when you release it off the long arm tension, they pull up. It's almost like the ribbing on the cuff of a sweater, right? Those parallel lines all pull up a little bit. So when I'm putting the binding on those quilts, I do 2 things. Number 1 is, again, in our example, we have horizontal. So on the sides is where it pulls up the most. I put more tension on my binding down those sides to have less binding, right? Because it's the part that's waving. So the quilt is going to pull up, so I stretch out that binding a bit so that there's less of it. Or sometimes when I'm at that top corner, I'll lay the quilt out flat, and let it relax, and I'll pin my binding. This is how much binding when the quilt is relaxed, and I don't let the quilt stretch out as I'm applying that binding. Does that make sense? So it's just a way of managing what is wanting to pull in. A third way might be to block your quilt with moisture first and smooth those straight lines out a bit, stretch them out a little bit, and then let it dry flat, and that will have less pull uppage, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's kind of what's happening. Wherever those lines are, they're wanting to pull up. Not so much the other way, but this way. Susie, I've never been in one place with so many Susans at once. It's quite wonderful. I don't know many of us in real life. So true. There are so many Susan quilters. It's funny. It's funny. Kim, when you do need to deep dive into a thread break issue, when you do need to, do you have a mental checklist or flow chart you work through when you troubleshoot? Yes, I do, Kim. And also, I'm happy to say it's not quite ready yet, but will be shortly. My students have received the first hot off the press little ebook, and I call it Tension Headache, anyone? Because we as quilters so often say we're having tension issues, but really we're having stitch formation issues, which can include thread breaks, right? So this little ebook is like 35 pages, small pages, of my checklist, my mental checklist, but I've got it down on paper. And I keep adding to it, so I think over time, that's why it's not going to be a printed book ever, because I'm going to keep adding to it and the ebook will keep growing. Anyway, it's available to my students already. They're kind of test driving it for me, and eventually I'll make it available to everyone. And it is just my accumulation of the things that I check for and look for and try. Some easy, some more difficult. Yeah. Sue, have you ever dipped your thread in mineral oil? I've seen some quilters on the internet do this. I have not, Sue. I have done a silicone treatment, and I'll be honest, I have not done it often. That's not usually where my mind goes when I'm having thread breaks, but it's a good point because that might be worth a try. Yeah. Juliana, I'm getting ready to quilt a crazy quilt. Any suggestions for E to E pattern? Oh gosh, Juliana, I think there's lots. My mind would run toward doing one something like this one where all the spacing is pretty even and overall it's just going to look like a texture. You're not going to see a flower or a butterfly, you're just going to see texture. But I mean, it could be filaments, it could be swirls, it could be parallel lines, it could be any number of things, yeah. Okay, that's it for questions. All right, you guys.
Except for
Elaine says she needs my ebook in the worst way. Well, Elaine, hopefully that will be days and not longer than that until I get that ready, probably on Amazon, because they have a nifty little option there for ebooks. Anyway, I'll let you know. This will be in the newsletter, by the way. I think I got muted there. Mr. Producer has the power. I was just starting to say, watch in my newsletter for information on the ebook. I hope to have it in the very next one. So. So I'm basting on the left, and I'll show you something just for interest. You'll notice that I've still got my regular stitching length on here. Again, this is just personal preference, but because this stitch line doesn't show, I just do what's convenient for me. If I feel like putting a 1/4 inch basting stitch on, I do. If I don't feel like taking the trouble to change it, I don't. It doesn't matter, right, is my point. All you're doing is securing the side edge of this quilt. It doesn't really matter what the stitches look like. Likewise, those earlier slanty edges that I did with scallops, it doesn't really matter. I'm just grabbing a pin here. Let's see if you guys will be able to see this if I move the machine out of the way. Probably not. My fabric, I might be able to see it on the overhead view. The edge of my fabric is not a straight cut. It's very curvy, and I don't know that I can get it in my side clamp. Oh, look, I got it. I got it. Okay, yardstick to hoist the whole thing up a little. Can you see how that just picks this up as opposed to it sagging down like that? Like, that's quite a difference. Very slick. These little scissors, by the way, were one of my Houston, I'm not much of a shopper, but I brought home a tiny pair of scissors. So I'll show it in this camera. They're just short little snips, but they have a tiny little curve in the blade and they have a blunt tip. So they are great little thread snips at the long arm. That tiny little curve helps to not poke it into the fabric, and of course the blunt tip helps as well. And I just store them right there. So handy. I've had a pair of small snips there for a long time, but they were getting dull. If I didn't hold them just right and sort of hold my tongue just right, I had to do it twice or 3 times. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Okay, here's a tip. Can you see right in front here, I've got a little fullness going on? A couple things. Number 1, I'm going to pull the area that's already stitched so it goes under the needle faster. And number 2, I am going to change to a basting stitch because a bigger stitch somehow helps pull that up better than a tiny stitch. I don't know why that is. I've heard other quilters say they sometimes use inch-long basting stitches when they have to really get some excess pulled in there. But can you see how my pulling behind, see how that just pulls it and it goes under the needle just a little bit faster? Sometimes I push it under with my fingers, whatever it takes. Pull with my fingernail, whatever it takes to get that fullness eased in. What I don't want to do is push it out in front of me. Then I'm going to have a problem at the end. Okay, our quilt is not very big today, but we do still need our magnets one more time on the front. Putting my other side clamp on. again, the cut edge is not terribly smooth, so it's a little bit finicky, but I got it. That's the main thing. Yardstick. We're good. Now, I mention this often. When I do an edge-to-edge design, I, on purpose, alternate the directions that I quilt. So my first row, I started in the upper right-hand corner and worked left. This time, I'm going to start in the left-hand side and work right. And my camera is hitting my yardstick. Okay, what's the deal here? We gotta finagle some stuff. Pretty funny. I might have to stop a moment and adjust things. I've kind of got them crisscrossing. Yeah, that's just not gonna work. This is funny. You would never know this if you were not trying to film this. Okay, I have to figure out a way to keep this up. Dave, I might need your help here actually at my arm for a minute. What's going to happen, I don't know if you guys can see this, what's going to happen is this is going to clip the yardstick when I come by. So you'll have to, right? But I need it lifted up most of the time so I don't hit this right here. I'm managing. Oh, that'll probably work. Okay. Mr. Producer fixed it, you guys. He has a shirt that says, how does it go, Dave? I know stuff and I fix things. Yes, that describes Dave in one sentence. You'll get a nice little view on the cardinal fabric and the little red truck fabric. Another thread chunk. This time I stopped and removed it. I'll let you in on a little secret. One of my favorite things to incorporate into freehand and all over designs like this is some type of echo. So I have a few quilting designs that have an echo in them, and the reason is they are absolutely so helpful when you need to travel. I think probably the number one thing that free motion edge-to-edge quilters say is, I keep getting myself quilted into a corner, you know, into an awkward place and can't get out of it. And that is one of my favorite solutions, is echo your way out of a bind. If only life were that easy, right? I'm just pausing a second to just even see where I've got to go here. Okay, I see it. So I talked about the fact that I alternate directions across the entire pass of the quilt top. And the reason for that is no matter how hard I try to not repeat myself, like keep things pointing in all different directions, inevitably when you are moving, as I am now, from left to right, you're going to get more loops that face in that direction. So then the reason for alternating the whole pass is it just makes it appear more random, less all in a row. And honestly, I do that for everything, whether it's floral, whether it's swirly, whether it's loops like this one. And I don't know, perhaps I'm not a terribly observant person, but I have this one quilting design that I've used a lot that I call a plume. And it's kind of a spiral with almost feathers around it. And a few years back, I quilted yardage of that, and then I cut it up and made a child's coat with it. Some of you may have seen my red 1950s child's coat. It's a thing of beauty. Anyway, I took it one week to my sewing group, my quilting group that meets regularly. And the first thing one of the ladies said was, "Oh, you quilted it in this direction." And you know, her eye just really caught that. She could see that definite directional tend, even of those spirals and plumes. And I confess, I did not see it. Maybe just because I was so close to it, you know, or had been the one doing the quilting. So that just made me conscious of that's something I need to be aware of, that I break up that directionality. And I'm not quilting quite as far forward as I could be on this pass, but being aware that I only have a very small one left, I want to leave enough space for maneuverability in that small pass. So I'm just not pressing all the way to the very, very bottom of this one. And it'll get caught in the next pass. And we broke thread again. Well, this is a puzzler. It does not, oh, now see, this time something's caught. I can feel it. I've got my presser foot up, I'm tugging on my thread, and there's pretty strong resistance. So the answer to that is cut thread, and rather than pull it backwards, I'm going to pull it from the needle end, if I can find it. There we go. So I'm not sure where it caught. I couldn't see it visibly. Occasionally that does happen. You know, you're spooling it off your spool at a great clip. And I see part of the problem. It's not in my I don't know that you guys can see this. It's not in my overtop thread carriers, and I'm not sure how it bounced out of those. But it's just kind of an object lesson. The littlest thing does make a difference. So when it comes right off my cone, it goes upwards over these thread carriers and then down into the threading system, and it had jumped out of those carriers. And then what happens is, you know, it spools off at a great rate. Sometimes it jerks and spools, and then you have a sag, and then that loop is probably what caught. I'm theorizing here, but those are the things that I look for. Okay, so it was just the top thread that broke. So first I'm going to take one stitch and pull up that bobbin thread and trim it off. And then again, we'll do what we did before. We'll back up to a good splicing place. I don't see any stripped thread like one fiber was broken. I think it just was whatever caught. It just caught and jerked and broke all in one fell swoop. So looking back, there's not really any great stopping points. So I'm just going to go ahead and do it in the green at the last point. It's not in the seam allowance, so I'll make sure to do a good overlap so that I'm sure it's caught. And by the way, if you don't like the look of a splice, this would be an absolute opportunity for tying and bearing the ends of the initial threads and then the ends of this new one that I'm adding in. I personally don't typically spend the time doing that, but you absolutely could, and this would be a good place for it, because you could make this invisible totally if you wanted to. Now I gotta make sure I know which way I'm going with my loops. Yep, got it. I'll stop when I go back, when I echo back here, so you guys can see it on camera and see what you think of the splice. So I'm going to trim off the threads. Here's the splice right here. Is that showing on camera, Dave? I can't see at all. Dave's just going to show me what we're seeing. Now you can kind of see it. You can see how you can't see it, basically. But because it's a green print fabric and a dark thread, that's where the splice is. And when I'm right up close to it, I can find it. But nobody viewing this whole tree skirt is going to find that. But that's what it looks like, and you certainly do have the option of tying and bearing those tails. Okay, let's see where we're at here. I want to echo my way back out of here. You see how I'm just traveling. I see that I want to quilt this area over here, so I'm literally just doing a giant echo to travel to the area that I want to quilt next. Because there's already echoes in the designs, because the spacing is approximately equal, it just looks all of a piece. Fits right in. So again, we're approaching the end of this pass. If you have any questions, it's a great time to be typing them in. If you are enjoying this live and unscripted look at quilting in my studio, please do give a thumbs up to the episode. Even consider sharing it and passing it on with your friends, to those who are interested in this same type of quilting. If you're looking for some easy listening in your studio, I do have a podcast called Measure Twice, Cut Once, and other life lessons learned from quilters. It is mostly interview based. It's me talking with other quilters and a few other crafters, not always quilters, just about what their craft has meant to them, what it has brought into their lives, in some cases the actual therapy that it has been for them. So, as I said, easy listening. Anywhere podcasts can be found, and also now on YouTube. My channel is Stitched by Susan. You're probably there, or maybe on Facebook now, but just look for the podcast playlist. If you're interested in supporting this show, you can do that very easily at buymeacoffee.com/stitched by Susan. All of those dollars just go toward bettering our equipment and producing a better and better show for you. Clearer cameras, better angles, all those things. I'm stitching on my Bernina Q24. I'm using Isocord 100% polyester thread in a 40 weight. This is a dark charcoal color today. And I have the same thread on the top and in the bobbin. I'm using size 90/14 universal needles. Nothing special there. That, by the way, is something I do really, really like about the Bernina, is the fact that it does use regular sewing machine needles. So, A, I have them already, and B, it allows me, when I want to do specialty things like throw on a jeans needle or a top stitching needle, or even a twin needle and put some decorative threads on there. But mostly just because it's easy. If you are just recently tuning in, today's episode I'm working on a tree skirt that belongs to a friend of mine. And because she had started quilting it on her domestic machine, she had already trimmed the backing and the batting to a hexagon shape. And so I talked at some length at the beginning about how I put extenders, how I figured out what size to make them, and how I added extenders onto those corners that were trimmed away in order to be able to load it onto the long arm and keep it square and straight. You know, these live and unscripted episodes, that's my whole intention, is that you are able to just come alongside me in my studio, see what I'm working on. It's not a lesson per se, as today you can see it's not always easy to see the quilting because I'm not really teaching the quilting design. I'm more just showing you, here's the project I'm working on, here's the features that are unique to it, and here's how I work with them. So this hexagon shape was part of it. You know, whether to use white batting or black was another of the considerations. So all these things, this is just real life quilting. Looks like I should have quilted down a little bit further. Ah well, we'll get it. So I'm seeing the end of my quilt now. I'm pulling up my leaders and I'm actually clipping them at both ends so that they don't slide off the rails and kind of pull my quilt askew. And as I did at the top, I'm going to take a few minutes to pin this bottom edge in place as well. Because of the angled corners, all too easy if I just stitch it from one side to the other to get it a little pulled out of shape, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to take a moment, put some pins in there just to establish the shape and make sure that it stays. Do we have any questions that I can be talking about while I... Okay, let's see some questions and I'll talk while I pin. Okay, Dorothy, how do we get the newsletter? Is it different from the emails? No, that's what the emails are, Dorothy. They're just commonly called a newsletter in emailing or marketing terms because they carry, you know, the news of my business. Suzanne, am I right in assuming you do not take out your basting stitches even if you do longer stitches? That's correct. I purposely keep them within 1/4 inch of the edge of the quilt so that they'll fall right inside the binding and therefore don't need to be undone. Christine, can you elaborate on the magnets you put on the frame? Sure, I can. Let me hold one up. Here it is. It's a simple bar. It's about 1 inch wide, maybe 1/2 inch thick. From a hardware store, exactly the type you'd see in a shop for tools, perhaps in a kitchen for knives. There is a link in the description below this episode, and pretty much every time I have these episodes, there's a link to them in case you can't find them at your local hardware store. Watch out, they're firm magnets. Watch out for your fingers and also your toes. Don't kick them. Ask me how I know. Okay. Susie, will you be coming to QuiltCon next year? It's in my hometown. Oh man, Susie, I don't know that I am. I was kind of hoping Bernina would send me there. And then I would say, yeah, pick me, I'll go. But I have not been sent to QuiltCon, so I don't think I am this coming year. It's a shame, actually. Okay, Madge, curious about what your biggest learning or aha moment was in Houston. Did you learn anything great from your Bernina colleagues or the quilters on the shop floor? I didn't get to see a ton of quilters on the shop floor, honestly. I did learn quite a bit from my colleagues, like just because that was my first time in Houston, period, but certainly my first time in Houston with Bernina. I just learned a lot from the ladies who've been doing it for years. I mean, some of them have been going for 25 years to the Houston show. And so it was really interesting to hear their stories. And then, of course, Bernina Longarms are only about 10 years old, but their wealth of knowledge was great. So I learned a lot about the frames and the models and the tables and all the things. Susie, is there a benefit to bury or splicing like you did? Well, the benefit to tying, knotting and burying is that it's pretty well invisible, right? You cut longer thread tails, you tie a little knot, and then with a needle you pull that knot inside between the layers. And if you match up the stitches just right, it's practically invisible. So that's the advantage to it. The reason I choose to go with splicing is because it's much, much faster. So unless it's really visible and I really need it to be invisible, I don't see the reason to spend the time tying and burying. Personal preference, for sure. Denise, is it possible the little threads from the unsewing left behind in the batting are interfering? I don't think so, Denise. I don't think so. They're very small. They're very small. I think probably what's going to happen is she'll wash this once and they'll come out and not spend the time picking them one at a time. Laura, is it filling in the space that determines the number of loops in an area? I noticed some are sets of 2 or 3, some are sets of 4 or 5. Okay, second part. When you do your loops, do you do an odd number of loops before you echo? Great questions. Kelly, with this design, I don't lean toward an odd number. I know in general odd numbers of groupings look better. I don't worry about that in this design. Laura nailed it. It just has to do with the space I'm trying to fill. That's all it is. I don't think it looks as great when you get 6 or 7 or 8 loops necessarily, so I don't do that very often. It's usually 3, 4, 5. Lori, what is the name of your quilting design you are using? Thanks. I call it Filaments, Lori, and this is my own design. I devised it straight from a paper napkin. I've got a picture of that napkin somewhere that has these filaments on it. Clearly someone else probably has that napkin too, because there is also a paper pantograph design that's really, really similar. I think it's called Knit One Purl 2. So if you're more comfortable doing pantographs, you might look for that. I just don't want anybody thinking I copied that design. I truly, truly did not. Straight off a paper napkin. But to me, it just looks like filaments. Lynn, what did you clip your leader with that holds it up? So are you meaning, Lynn, this black part? Is that what you're meaning? Or do you mean at the ends when I was pulling it on? That's probably what you meant. Okay. So my frame has 2 of these on each end of the frame. Let's come to the other end so you can see. Here we are. So my frame has 2 of these. They're on elastic straps at each end. So when I put my clamp on here, I also attach one of these to that. That's what provides the tension. And I just keep the front pair of them usually really short. And like when I'm finished one quilt, I usually clip my leader to them just to hold that leader up in place. And I've done that now in the middle of my quilt just because it keeps that leader from sagging off with this small quilt. Okay, back in the picture. Mary Jo, I watched you quilt the whole cloth pink chevron with feathers baby quilt. I immediately went to town for fabric, came home and made one. So very cute. Yes, I've done a few of those, Mary Jo, with differing designs, but I think that pink one is among my favorites too. I love doing feathers. So, Susan, having grown up in a machine shop, I find the thought of wearing rings while operating a long arm makes me nervous. Oh gosh, I honestly never have thought of that. I've never pierced a finger or anything at the long arm. Knock, knock on wood. Patsy, do you make your loops in one direction all the time or do you reverse it? I reverse it on purpose. I try and make them left, right, up, down. The more random you can make it look, the better, so that they don't look like they're perfectly placed. And that's it. Okay, you guys. We are basting this last edge, so I pinned while we talked. I actually need a couple more pins. Couple more pins. I was out on this side. So what I'm going to do, I didn't quilt down quite as far as I maybe should have. I can't, in fact, finish this quite in one pass. But because it's so close, I am going to go ahead and baste it all, and then I'll just back up about 3 inches, just enough so I can reach to where I finished quilting before. All right, let's turn the 1/4 inch basting stitch on. So again here, there's no reason that you need to scallop by any means. Someone was asking that earlier because I scalloped on the upper angled edges. You certainly don't need to. Just, you can probably see my diagonal is totally wonky. It doesn't really matter. I just thought a scallop looked better than a wonky diagonal. But again, I'm very close to the edge of the quilt. It's all going to be hidden in the binding. And for those of you who are asking, yes, I do stitch over pins. And I've never hit one of those either. Like to the, I hear them click sometimes, but I've never broken pin or needle. But I do it during basting and do it slowly. So that's my rationale. But I do kind of put a disclaimer in there. That's not the right way, perhaps, to do it. But this is an honest show. It is the way I, in fact, do it. If I lift the pins out, it just does not hold the fabric in place, right? So I find that if I take it slow and easy, it has not been a problem to date. You can see, much like I did on the side, I'm just pulling a little bit, this time just with my fingernail, on what's already been stitched, making what's coming under the needle pass through just a little bit faster. Yeah, that is not a pretty basting stitch. But hey, we don't have to have pretty basting stitches. Okay, basting complete. I'll take Susie is asking if I have tutorial on tying and burying threads. I know I have one on stopping and starting, and the thumbnail on it is kind of a iris color, kind of mauvey colored fabric. Does it include tying and burying threads? I just cannot at this moment remember. Okay, here's an example for you guys. Let's see, let's get that overhead on so you can see a little bit. So my edge over here, I know you can hardly see. I can't get Stella where you can see it. Well, my yellow corner that's pieced on here, I did not trim up all those edges, which did not interfere with my loading process, but is now interfering a little bit with my clamping process. So if I had enough excess, I would literally just do this. I would take my single clamps and I would just put it on there. My problem today is I don't have very much excess fabric here. So probably what I'll do is put that on there and remove it when I get close to the edge, and there's going to be no clamp when I'm quilting the last few inches, because I'm going to run into that if I quilt over to it with my machine. So, you know, the answer might have been for me to trim this up. The truth is it's pretty skimpy either way. So we're going to go ahead and put those side clamps on, and we'll just loosen them off as we get near them. Oh, that reminds me. I got to back up a little bit, right? Yes, indeedy. My little clampies that are on the ends of the leaders I have to let go. All these things. All the things. should be enough. Okay, my last pass I went left to right, so this one I'm going to start right and move left. A few lock stitches. Because we've talked a fair bit about how many loops and why, why I make changes in how many, let me just give you one of the tips that sort of runs through my head when I'm thinking how many loops to put in a space. When I look at a design like this that has fairly even texture, right? The loops are they're a little more than 1/4 inch wide. The echo is a little more than 1/4 inch away from the loop, etc. When I look at all of that, I think of that when I'm looking at a sort of awkward corner and thinking, should I put in another loop or should I not? If that spacing is, 1 inch or 1.5 inches, then I think, yes, I should. Because if I don't put a loop in there, relative to the rest of the quilt, that's a pretty big unquilted spot. And it's going to be puffy and stick up, right? So that's kind of how I think of things when I'm thinking, should I put another loop in here or not? It's relative to the spacing of my quilting. I mentioned before that I don't like leaving, can we see a front camera for, well, I don't know which is the best one to show. Maybe the side one, the overhead. I'll move this, whew, terrible squeak. When I'm working near the end of my quilt, right, I can't quite finish in this one pass now, but I don't like leaving a little 4 or 5 inch area unquilted because it's going to get difficult to maneuver. So what I'm going to do then is just quilt, I don't know, 8 or 10 or 12 inches up here, not a full pass, move the quilt up, and then I've got a sizable pass for my very last one. Does that make sense? That just helps my maneuverability. The bigger your quilting design is, the more that matters. If you've got 5 inches and you're trying to put a big 5-inch design in there, it's hard to place them in there. So not leaving yourself too tiny of a little pass can help. Another bad squeak coming up. Whew! Need some WD-40, hon. So that's why I've kind of echoed my way up to the top now. I just want to get in here and finish some space at the top here, get a little bit filled in enough that I can advance my quilt and then get the whole rest of it in one pass. Did you see me pause there? I had one really awkward little space. That doesn't happen to me very often, I'll be honest, because I've done this so many times, but it did happen. And I actually took a backwards loop in there, and I did it on purpose, thinking to myself, I'm either going to have a couple lines that are right on top of each other, or I'm going to have this other shaped loop. And I decided that the other shaped loop would show up less than 2 lines right over top of each other or crisscrossing where I didn't want them to. This is how my head works when I'm quilting like this, and I will often just gently pause to think it through, to make that decision, and then keep on going. This is super forgiving fabric because of its busyness. Again, it's one of those two-sided coins. It's difficult to see where you're going, but also no one else will be able to see if you make oopses either. There's a big one. I'm finding that I'm just leaning right into this quilt. I so cannot see on some of these fabrics. So if you wonder why my eyes are 6 inches away from the quilting, that's why. One of you, I think maybe Madge, was asking if I had an aha moment in Houston. And I think I did, and it didn't have to do with the Bernina booth at all. It had to do with, as I was out on the floor viewing... Oh, we just ran out of bobbin thread. Conveniently, right at the edge of the quilt, you guys, seriously, a half an inch from where I was in that basting stitch. I just have to undo about 3 stitches and overlap. Anyway, aha moment. It's out on the floor looking at all the beautiful quilts. I mean, the handiwork of some of those quilts was amazing to behold, as I'm sure you can imagine. But what struck me, the aha moment, was the variety. From people whose applique skills were amazing, or their hand quilting skills, or their use of color, or how well they told a story with the quilt, or the feelings that it evoked. I mean, it just went on and on and on. There was just so much difference in those quilts, and it just inspired me to realize, you know, we each have our different ways of creating, and they're all artistry. And it was just so eye-opening to see so many all together, so close, and all at once. It was just amazing. So here I am at this little clip, and I'm going to just take it off while I'm doing this bottom corner. And in fact, I think I'm far enough now that I can advance and be able to see all the way to the end. So if you're looking in the overhead camera, are we at all? You can see how these are kind of, you know, they're pulling. If I don't hike them up, they pull, and they really pull this edge askew and stretch it. And so that's where I put my little clamps. And these are just my same clamps that I put on my, the clamps that came with my frame that I pull my side clamps with. I've just got a couple short ones, and it just holds that leader up and holds everything kind of square and flat. My lovely yellow extenders, aren't they just the cutest? Great way to get rid of ugly fabric. Tiny bit of fullness in this little border. I'm just kind of hanging on to it with my left hand, making sure it gets evenly quilted into those loops. Loops are admirably suited for taking up the excess. I just want to make sure I don't get any pleats. Just picking a few threads off. Just got to take a close look here. That tweedy fabric is super hard to see on. Oh my word. I'm going to forward just about 2 inches more. Just like that. That should be the last little adjustment. And now we're just going to power through to the finish line. So, last chance to type in any questions or comments about this. And honestly, I'd love to hear if you guys have any great ideas for tree skirts this Christmas. It is the season to be thinking about it. While I was away in Houston, well, I should preface this story by saying I always have good intentions, but I never get the Christmas tree up till, well, usually a few days before Christmas if I'm lucky. So, my daughter, who lives close by, actually came and set up my tree while I was gone. So this year, I am making up for it. Like, we're weeks from Thanksgiving, but I've already got a Christmas tree, by golly. And I love it because it's really pretty. Someone else did it, which makes it particularly enjoyable. And I'm like, I get to enjoy this for weeks and weeks and weeks. I love it. It's not a real tree, by the way, but it is sure cute. And the ribbon she put in it is all red and black plaid. It's the cutest little thing. So that was a fun surprise when I came home. Those little pauses are me just taking a second to assess the areas that I need to fill and which direction I think I should go next. And if your pauses are longer, no worries. You have to consider I've quilted this design, I don't know, on 25 quilts for sure. So I've quilted a lot of loops, and still, sometimes I have to pause just a touch, say, now where have I been? Where do I need to go? What's the most efficient way to get there? And I've got this front corner that hasn't been quilted, so I'm going to travel all the way down to it and go ahead and get it done. I was kind of chuckling the other day. You know the old story about the cobbler's children going barefoot? Basically meaning, you know, he makes shoes for everyone except his own kids. Well, it's a bit like that with tree skirts in our family. So a couple winters ago, maybe 2, I got in the tree skirt mood, and we have 4 adult kids as they've all got their own homes. And so I made 4 tree skirts that year, every one of them different and unique. And meantime, I have like a dollar store variety tree skirt. Isn't it funny how that works? So one of these days, okay, I do have to decide how I want to fill in this last corner. I think I'll do the bit that's furthest away from me at the top first, and then I'll come to the corner that's right close to me at the front, very last. It is kind of different having 8 corners to fill in instead of 4. Almost there. Last chance for questions or comments, folks. And there we are. Nice few lock stitches out in that basted perimeter. Trim our threads and we're golden. Okay, so I'm going to scooch Stella all the way off to the side. You know, I know you can't see it on the camera, but I will try and get some good photos in daylight so that you can see the texture of it. But I just think this is so well suited to the tree skirt, where honestly no one's going to get up close and view the quilting. You just want something that overall looks textural and pretty and like a quilt, and I think this will be perfectly suited. So a few brass tacks again. These odd little yellow corners are because it was cut into a hexagon shape already. Joanne, whose quilt it is, had started quilting it at her domestic machine and it was getting too fiddly, right? But she had already trimmed these corners. So I just added little fabric extenders onto the corner, trimmed my edge closest to me straight, so I had one straight edge to begin with, and loaded it at the long arm. So that's at the beginning of the episode, lots of details on that. And then used white batting because there are light colored fabrics, couldn't put a black batting in it, but went ahead and did this all over sort of filaments design with black thread. I used 40 weight, 100% polyester thread in a really dark charcoal, and I just used a very ordinary 9014 universal needle. What other details? I think that's about it. And then it's just this edge to edge quilting. I did use a finer stitch length, knowing that it's just one big hexagon now, but eventually Joanne's going to cut right into the middle of it, right? And cut the center hole for the tree trunk and bind the perimeter. So I stitched it at 12 stitches per inch so that those stitches are just a little more secure when she cuts into them. And I'm going to recommend to her that she cuts it and binds it right away without much handling, and then I think it will be okay. Okay, can I see the screen? I'm getting a couple sips of coffee and I'm dry. Okay, more questions or comments before we go. And by the way, I am back well from the quilt, in case you're worried about my coffee spills. Mom and Pop Quilt Shop. Oh, awesome. Fellow YouTubers. Love your quilting. Totally suits the project. Beautiful and so very talented. Thank you. And again, what's your preferred thread to work with on your long arm? Today I have Isacord on. I'm not really brand specific, but I do love 100% polyester thread, trilobal polyester, just because they're super low lint and so well suited towards high speed stitching and a lot of stitching. Strong thread, low lint. Love 100% poly. Sandy, how long are your filament loops? You know, they vary quite a bit, Sandy. More than an inch, inch and a quarter, even inch and a half for the most part. And the echoing is like 3/8-ish of an inch as well. Marion, how would you load a double wedding ring quilt, one without borders? So I'm assuming it's got the scallops, Marion. You know, I would load the backing flat, as we did with today's quilt, and then I would follow the process I did today. I had angled corners, so I pinned them in place, got everything placed where I wanted it, and pinned it before I started basting. I would do that same thing on a double wedding ring. And I did one in a pair of live and unscripted episodes called Vintage Gems. Vintage Gem, maybe. It was a year or two back, but it was a double wedding ring, and I went through the whole process on air, so you can watch that being done if you want to see it in more detail. Penny, on your Christmas tree skirts, did you create an opening after it was quilted? Yes, I did, Penny. On all of mine, I did as well. I'm thinking over them one at a time because they were all a bit different. And yes, I quilted them as a whole. In one or two cases, I think I marked where the opening was going to be and was a little more strategic about where I placed the quilting, but I did cut through the quilting. Absolutely I did, and then bound them. It's not, they don't get washed and washed and washed, right? Like ordinary quilts would. Joan, what is the Isacord color number? Let me see, Joan, I'll have a peek. It is 4174. Fantabulous backs, I love that. As a free motion person myself, I so appreciate the work of other free motion long armors. Thank you, good. I love featuring it too. It's just so often on social media, we want to show off the glamorous, gorgeous things that we do, right? But this is, it shows how to make workmanlike, almost utilitarian quilts still beautiful. And that's what I love to do. Zanita, I made a tree skirt for myself, but it's waiting to be quilted. You make me want to go upstairs to do it right now. You should. You should. And then show us pictures, okay? We want to see what you're doing. Lynn, I know you're so practiced, but you make it seem doable. I'm looking forward to when I can join the membership. In the meantime, thank you. You're welcome. I hope I can do that for many quilters, Lynn, just to show the doableness of it. And I hope my realness, you know, showing all the warts and wrinkles helps to make you realize it's very doable. Madge, thanks, Susan, for the video and updates from Houston. Not able to travel at this time due to some health challenges, but I live vicariously through all of the videos shared online. Yes, there were lots of people there who shared, which was lovely. The quilting brings the piecing to life. It looks terrific. As always, your generous sharing of expertise elevates the entire quilting community. Thanks, Susan and Dave. I appreciate that, Madge. Okay, that's it for comments. All right, once again, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do give it a thumbs up. Take a moment to share it with your friends, and also click on the bell when you've subscribed so that you'll be notified whenever I am coming live. And I try and do this 2 Fridays a month, usually at 9 a.m. Pacific. Always different projects. It's usually client quilts, so it's subject to the types of things that come in, but I just try and make it about whatever features or even challenges are part of that quilt, and that's just part of the discussion, and you get to look over my shoulder while I'm quilting. So I invite you to tune in next time. It will be probably in early December, maybe the very last Friday of November. We'll see how it goes. Thanks for tuning in. I have sure appreciated spending a couple of hours with you, and I'll see you next time.